The following program is produced by Marshfield Community Television.
Is The Voyage of the Comrade, a tale of William H. Upham's 1913 fateful trip. And it was kind of an interesting trip, as we'll get into. But I got interested in this subject, it'd be probably 6 years ago. I work at the Northwood County Historical Society and at the Governor Upham House, or the Upham Mansion as some people know it, most people know it. And just going through the different learning of who Mr. Upham was and going through the different artifacts and things, I ran across a picture of his yacht and didn't really think much about it at the time. But then the more I found out about him and the more I learned who he was and his story, then the yacht kept coming back. And I like maritime history, so it was something that I wanted to dig into. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mr. Upham, he came to Marshfield in 1878, and it was because his brother Charles, who was over in Shawano, was looking for more places to tap into wood industry. He had, Shawano and Angelica were two areas where the Uphams had been located. William had been in Angelica, but they started looking around, and Marshfield was the best place to come because there wasn't anybody who had tapped into the trees that were here. And unlike like Wisconsin Rapids has the Wisconsin River, Marshfield had a creek, but it also had trains, and so the trains is what brought them here. So they came in 1878, and by 1887, he's the mayor of Marshfield. And he goes on, he builds the Upham House in 1880, and he goes on to become Wisconsin's 18th governor, serves from 1895 to 1897. His first wife, Mary, passed away in 1912, and they had been married for over 40 years, and so when she passed away, he was pretty saddened by that. They had been spending their winters down in the southern climes, mainland around Florida, but in 1911, she was not doing well. Even early in the year, she had pneumonia. And that whole last year that she was alive, from the December of 1911 through when she passed away, November of 1912, her health was not that good. So Mr. Upham did spend a lot of time in the South, and so the Comrade is part of that story, going down south, primarily to escape Wisconsin River winters. He had a son-in-law, Phil Sawyer, who had a yacht, and that may or may not have been something that contributed to the idea of having his own yacht. But in August of 1913 is when the Comrade was built. And actually, when the order came in to Dan Kidney and Son in DePere, Wisconsin, Dan Kidney and Son had been known for river boats and lake boats, mainly things like sporting, duck hunting, and crafts that could go out onto the lakes and the rivers and just do sporting things. They had done some yachts, like 34-footers, but it wasn't until Mr. Upham ordered his 55-foot long yacht that they hadn't put anything out this big before. So it was 55 feet long and then 11 foot wide, or 11 foot at the beam, and quite a lot of room actually as well. One of the reports was saying that when you go down below the bridge, it was uncommon to have that much space. So when he was thinking about putting this together, he was really anticipating living on it. So the living space was quite big. Equipped with electric light plant from Lawson and Lawton, and that name comes again later in our story. And it was a gasoline engine. And this is something that Lawson and Lawton were doing primarily for farmers at the time. They were getting the electrical plants up and running for folks out in the rural areas, but also they did have other engines besides that were gasoline powered. It was 45 horsepower domain engine, which is different from the electrical engine. So there's two different gasoline powered engines that are doing different jobs. And then the headroom, as it says, in the engine room alone was 6 foot, and then 7 foot in the cabin capacities. And if you were to look, let's see if we can get this thing going, right here where these 3 portholes are, that's where the engine room sat. In the forward part here, this is where the front cabins were, or one cabin. It held 4 different berth spots. And then up forward here was the locker room and the galley. So way up in front is where the kitchen was. In the aft part, behind the engine room, is the other salon where Mr. Upham had his own accommodation space. And then the price tag came to $5,000 in 1913. Today that would be about $125,000. So it's a state-of-the-art kind of craft. This is an interior shot that I found. On the left here, this is the forward, if I can get this pointer going right here. This is the forward salon, and behind this door would be the galley. And right here, these partitions here could flip up so that there could be 2 people on this side and 2 people on that side. And then this is in the afterward, that is where Mr. Upham's cabin was, and in between, they don't show it, but in between the two would be where the engine room is. I was really thrilled when I found this picture because all I had was outside shots, but to have something on the inside was pretty remarkable. This is Dan Kidney and Son factory, and when I got in contact with the DePere Historical Society and asked them if they had anything that we could use, they actually had 3 different factories that Dan Kidney and Son had over the course of time that I'm aware of. And the second factory, they said, is where the Comrade would have been made or put together. And this particular boat right here has similar lines, actually, to what we saw before that the Comrade had. Dan Kidney had some lines in his craft that kind of carried over from boat to boat. So it was kind of interesting when they were able to give me what the plant looked like in DePere there. So after he has his yacht done, it takes 3 months. 14th of August, he sends in the order, and they are ready to launch it on the 1st of November, 1913. And his intended trip is to go from DePere down to Chicago, down the Canal to the Illinois River to the Mississippi. And he wanted to get out of town fast because winter's setting in and things are going to start shutting down. But there's a couple of things that kind of stood in the way. The first one is November 5th, he's called away back to Shawano because his brother Charles, who helped set up the establishment here in Marshfield years and years before, has diabetes, and he's actually on his deathbed. One of the articles said that he had had gangrene in one of his feet, and they were looking to amputate. So on the 5th of November, Mr. Upham has to leave DePere, go to Shawano, and spend some time with his brother Charles. And then he goes back, and they head out on the 7th of November. And with them are these people. He did have a captain, an engineer, and a cook with him. Some of the earlier articles were talking about that only Mr. Upham and his friend Mr. Quinn were going to be the crew, but that turned out not to be true. And the cook was Mr. Whittingham from Arpin, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I don't know how far he went with him. It was we know that the captain went as far as Sturgeon Bay, and the engineer, I think he may have gone most of the way with him, but we don't know much about these guys. But then the 7th, they left for Sturgeon Bay on the 7th, and they got there on the 7th. So it was a very short trip. However, they ran into another thing. Mr. Upham ran into a bunch of storms on this excursion, and this was the first first of them. It was the Great Storm of 1913. It's the biggest thing that ever hit the Great Lakes, and it basically was two weather patterns kind of converging together over the Great Lakes. Kind of started forming on the 6th over on the west side of Lake Superior, and then one was coming this way and another one was coming right up to it. And so by the 9th, the biggest part of this storm is hitting. And unfortunately, Lake Huron is the one that gets the most damage due to it. But Mr. Upham is kind of hunkered down in Sturgeon Bay, not going anywhere, which is pretty good for him. Right here is Mr. Upham's pointer. He's here in Sturgeon Bay. And this particular map, you can see there's some other boats that are all along here. The gray ones are those that basically got hung up, and then the black ones, and you can see a whole bunch down here in Lake Huron. Those are the ones that foundered and had total loss of life. And there was quite a number of people who were killed as a result of this storm. So little did Mr. Upham know that when he chose to go, it was the perfect time to go, really, because he was safe where he was. Had he gone any earlier, he might have been further down the Lake Michigan. So he escaped storm number 1. And from there, he went to Chicago and met up with his daughter, Elsie, and son-in-law, Edwin. And they rode together until St. Louis. And then the other person that came along was Colonel Quinn, who Mr. Upham knew from his West Point Academy days. And Mr. Upham had been a prisoner of war. He had been shot and left for dead on the battlefield in the Civil War. And as a result of being exchanged back to the North, he met up with President Lincoln, and Mr. Lincoln appointed him to West Point Academy. And he graduated there from 1866. Well, interestingly enough, this guy had a very similar story. Also got shot up, according to what I read, in Manassas, and same battle as Mr. Upham, and then was recuperating up in Washington when Mr. Lincoln sauntered through and kind of appointed him to West Point also. So it was kind of interesting when I ran across that article, because there was the story of stolen boots in both stories. Both men are laying somewhere, and both men's boots are going to be taken by a Confederate person. So it's just kind of interesting whose story is really whose. Maybe they're both all the same. He was born in Westminster, Massachusetts, and he moved to Racine when he was still pretty young, about preteen years. So Colonel Quinn stays. Mr. Upham does get out of the military in 1869, but Mr. Quinn stays on, and I'm not going to read this to you, but he has quite the CV, quite the military history in all of these different places, and he ends up at one time being in St. Louis in that area for a period of time. So it made sense for him when he joined Mr. Upham up in Chicago to disembark in St. Louis, because he has a daughter there, and he's going to stick around, and then he's going to go back. He can't fly back to New York, but he can take a train back to New York. So that's who Mr. Quinn is, Colonel Quinn. And this was kind of interesting. When I was looking through the papers, an account came up that Mr. Finney, Mr. Upham's son-in-law, had written up. And over on the side, let's see if I can read that. No, I don't have that. And basically it says, we went aboard Comrade in Chicago, enjoyed a very interesting trip through the drainage canal to Joliet. From there we made a 60-mile trip through 37 locks by way of the old Illinois Canal. This canal, though 50 feet wide, had so little water in it, our speed was only about 4 miles an hour. At LaSalle, we entered the Illinois River and reached Peoria at night. Too late to, instead of making harbor, we chose or anchored off the town. Weather was warm. We sat on deck. Light clothes, enjoyed contrast with Wisconsin winters to the utmost. So they just come out of this big storm, and now they're sitting in their shirt sleeves on the deck. Mr. Upham was called back from Peoria to attend the funeral of his brother in Shawano, and was to reach the boat again the morning after we left St. Louis for home. So Charles did die, and Mr. Upham was able to go back to Shawano to the funeral. So he did have the opportunity to say goodbye to his brother, but then he was able to go back and be there for his funeral as well. This is a map of the old drainage canal. Now, there was in 1900, there was a new canal that was put together. It was the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. And that one pretty much kind of ran alongside the old Illinois and Michigan Canal. And the Illinois and Michigan was a bit obsolete, so they put in this new one, 1900, but for some reason, the Comrade didn't go down the new one, it went down the old one and had to hit 37 locks just to go to where it was going. So I don't know why they chose that one, but it just kind of found that rather interesting. So they get to New Orleans, 15th of December. That's when Mr. Quinn leaves, and this is where Mr. Upham hits his second storm, the Christmas storm in the Gulf of Mexico. And it gives a bit of description of there, talking about how vessels are gone missing, and some of them are eventually found, but there are about 3 of them that do founder. The storm began Sunday night, basically gained intensity, and then on Christmas Day was like the biggest day, the strongest that the storm was. So once again, Mr. Upham finds himself in another big storm that is quite problematic, could be problematic for his own vessel, but according to some of the information, he tied up for 10 days as a result of this. So here we have kind of an outline of where he went. New Orleans, 15th of December, purportedly till the 7th of January. We'll get into that a little bit, and he misses the Christmas storm. Now, some of these don't have dates because they were points that came up in later interviews that people had done with him, and they just said, we went here, we went here, we went here. So Biloxi was one, Fort Morgan. You can see where the stars are coming up as well. Mobile, Alabama, and that one we know a date because the newspapers had reported him there at that time. 14th of January, he's in Pensacola. He's there for about 2 weeks. 19th to 20th, he's in Camp Walton, Florida. Port St. Joe on the 23rd. Tampa by the 30th. Miami, Jacksonville. And then not sure when he gets to Savannah, but he's about there for 2 weeks, and he's visiting with his daughter Carolyn and Phil Sawyer, who are in Augusta, and they have a house there, so Mr. Upham goes there quite often. 26th of March, he arrives in Charleston, South Carolina, and another storm, storm number 3, causes him to stay in Southport, where he meets Grace Mason. Grace eventually becomes his second wife. So he meets her, and it's a very short kind of meeting because he is moving on, but they start corresponding with each other and start chatting with each other. And what's interesting is on this trip, he is 73, almost 74 years old, and Grace is 29, almost 30. So it's a bit of an age range that's going on there, and it kind of falls into some of the narrative in the story a little bit later as well. Fort Monroe, Virginia, and he leaves the Comrade in New York because the canals aren't opening up until June, and he needs to get back to Wisconsin anyway. So by 16th of May, he's in Oshkosh, and then he returns to Marshfield. Now, I have a star up by the 7th of January saying how long this storm was, and the fact that, supposedly Mr. Upham was anchored out of harm's way for that long. And all the papers, when he was making his itinerary, Cuba was on his docket. It was one of the places he wanted to go. He had been there in 1912 when his first wife, Mary, was suffering from pneumonia. He had actually gone and spent some time in Panama and, again in the southern climes, got to Havana. And he had always intended on going there, but in one of the articles it said he changed his plans because of this Christmas storm. But when I was doing a bit of research at the DePere County Historical Society, or DePere Historical Society, I ran across a little question mark there, an article. And this is the only place that I've found that Mr. Upham supposedly went to Cuba, dated January 23rd, 1914. The Lawson & Lawton Company has sold one of its electric light plants to a man in Puerto Rico, and it will be shipped within a few days. The order was unexpected. It was given after the Puerto Rican had seen demonstration of one of the plants. He was visiting in Havana, Cuba recently when the seagoing gasoline yacht Comrade with former Governor H Upham on board entered the harbor. This is the boat built and equipped at the kidney plant in this city and which left for southern waters last November. The little craft attracted a great deal of attention while in Havana, and Mr. Upham allowed those wishing to do so to board the boat and inspect it. The Puerto Rican was amongst the number, and he was so favorably struck with the utility of the electric light plant on board, which was installed by the Lawson and Lawton Company, that he at once decided to order one for his residence in Puerto Rico. And this was the 23rd. This is appearing in the Brown County Democrat on the 23rd of January. But if you look back here, on the 23rd of January, Mr. Upham is in Florida. So there's been a bit of time between when he could have gone to Cuba and when this report is coming to DePere saying, hey, we want to buy an electric plant from Lawson and Lawton. And I kind of wonder if he just kind of secreted away. And he comes home, he's in Marshfield, and clandestinely he is corresponding with Grace, and nobody's really knowing that this is happening. And we don't really have any indication of any correspondence until the 3rd of February. A few years ago, his granddaughter, Monty, who's now 70, she had given us, at the Historical Society, a whole stack of letters that had been between Mr. Upham and Grace. And there was more Mr. Upham's writing to Grace. There weren't any from Grace to him, so all you get is a one-sided conversation. But through that, where I'm missing information from the newspapers, I'm able to pick things up from the letters. So from the February 3rd letter, we find out that he is in Augusta, Georgia, and he's probably visiting his daughter, Caroline. But then the 23rd of February, Colonel Quinn dies, his friend from West Point who had traveled the Mississippi with him. And unfortunately, Mr. Upham's not able to go there because I think he's probably visiting Grace. I did find in the 26th February letter, I was loath to leave Beaufort. He doesn't really, the newspapers don't really say where he is or when, but I think he's kind of going back and forth visiting her. Because there's another one, and March 1st he writes that he plans to be back in Beaufort the next evening. So I think he's coming and going and visiting her. And in the meantime, nobody knows anything except her sister and brother. Would be her brother and sister-in-law, I believe. They kind of catch on that something's in the wind, and so they're able to find out. She lets them know. I thought this was kind of cute when it was talking about when he was planning on going. I started the letter undecided as when I would come back, but now I know it's tomorrow, and I'll be drowned if I do not get there by 7 o'clock sharp tomorrow night if I do not see you sooner. So the way he writes, it starts out in his early letters, Dear Grace, and then after the meetings up in here after these dates, it becomes my dearest Grace. So the way that he addresses her has changed. So there's something that's going on. And then shortly afterwards, we're starting to read, too, that they have made a date for the 1st of June to get married, again, secretly. Spends a lot of time back in Marshfield, and, well, excuse me, after he leaves Marshfield, he goes back out. He's in Augusta, Georgia, and he's traveling around. He realizes that Mr. Quinn's passed away. He did send a letter to his widow, sending his condolences. By the 27th, he's in Baltimore, and then on the 28th, he does go to visit Colonel Quinn's widow. And they live fairly close. And he writes to Grace that, let's see, yesterday I went out to Colonel Quinn's and spent the day with Mrs. Quinn. I was glad I did. She gave me a little book of West Point life with caricatures, and I had a copy in 1866 when I was officer of the guard. I gave it to Jefferson Davis to look at as he graduated from West Point in 1829. He was so much pleased that I gave him the book and have been without a copy. I gave him the book and have been without a copy ever since. Now I have the copy Mrs. Quinn gave me. She also gave me the Colonel's fountain pen and a pair of marine glasses that were given him by the city of St. Paul when he was an engineer officer there. I'm writing with the Colonel's pen this letter to you. I just thought that was really touching. Here's this man that he's known for so long, and he's not able to go to the funeral, but when he visits, he receives these things. And this is the book that we have, actually, that he writes that little narrative in the cover of this book, talking about how he received it and the history that's all a part of it. But it was really touched when I read the part where he said, I'm writing with his pen. That was just pretty sweet. April, he needs to get back to Marshfield, but also there's some things that he's out east for, and he wants to go to Atlantic City because he wants to leave the Comrade there. He has an appointment in Philadelphia that he needs to get to, but once again, another storm. He ends up in the Easter storm. So he's in Christmas storm, he's in the Easter storm. And between 1913 and 1915, it seems like the states are being hammered by a lot of storms. The Great Lakes in 13. During the Christmas storm, the eastern seaboard also was getting hammered by another different Christmas storm. And then again in Easter, they get pounded again. And these are snow totals. 6 inches in Atlantic City. Newark has 15, and Philadelphia has 19. And he's going towards Philadelphia, so he's going towards a big pile of snow. So he manages to, and he talks about wanting to get out and go do, but they can't even get out on their top deck, because they're afraid of getting blown away. So they just stay under deck for quite a while. He does mention that Comrade needs repairs, and so by the time he's able to get out, he leaves it at Atlantic City, meets up with Fred and Helen Upham, his nephew, and his nephew's wife. And all along he's telling Grace, I'm going to tell them, I'm going to let them know so that somebody knows, and I know them. And again, he doesn't say anything until much later. So he keeps telling her, I'm going to tell him, or even you should tell your brothers and sisters that you're going to be marrying a reputable Wisconsin person. But he's not going to make any demands on them. And then he also says in a letter he's writing to her, ceremony is to be private, or something of that kind. No use of affronting people. So he's trying to be secretive, but he's also wanting to let the cat out of the bag. And he's kind of, his adopted daughters that are older than Grace, are kind of heavy on his mind too. In March 2nd, 20th, going backwards, March, April. The only thing that troubles me is the daughters. They've always been good children. Elsie is 45, Caroline is 39 at this time. And I've been ready to go barefoot for them if necessary. if you could only be 40 for the next few months and wear glasses, it would approximate more to my age and render less likely any insidious remarks. And then on the 28th, he writes, oh, excuse me, that's on the 20th. So this whole keeping secret from his daughters, is kind of weighing heavy on his heart. And actually, after he tells them, and it's not until like the 29th of April that he lets them know, and he's trying to prepare for this wedding, he keeps writing Grace, I should have said something. I should have mentioned something. I wish I had told them. So it was just kind of funny. Anyway, he doesn't tell Fred and Helen at this point, but they do find out a bit later. So the Comrade, he leaves the Comrade and travels to the Loyal Legion ceremonies that's happening in Philadelphia, which is commemorating the remaining men who had fought in the Civil War. And I thought it was funny. He remarks about that when he's not overly, doesn't have a lot of good things to say about the ceremony itself, but he says, the orator talked so low, was afraid a corpse might roll over and distract the meeting. So then he said, too, that every time he was introduced, he had a different name. So his name got butchered every time. So he didn't have a lot to good say about this thing, but he went. By the 26th of April, he's back in Marshfield, and on the 29th of May is when, well, actually, this should be April. He finally tells his daughters that he has intentions to marry Grace. So he spends most of the time, I'm learning this through his letters and preparing the place for Grace to be, telling her, you'll love Wisconsin in the summer, we'll be down there in the winter, and just kind of preparing her for coming up here. He arrives, he leaves again to head out east to get to the wedding. He arrives in Beaufort, and finally the family is aware that things are going on, but also the Chippewa Valley Herald puts out on the 30th of May that Mr. Upham's to marry, and it's a surprise. He'll bring a bride with him, Miss Grace Mason of Beaufort, South Carolina, member of a well-known Southern family. But I thought this was kind of interesting too. Back in Beaufort, they know he's coming in, but they didn't know why. And the one part that is really funny is in the second line. The affair grew apace, not becoming known until today when the groom-to-be walked into the office of the Register of Deeds and made application for the marriage license, which was happening that day. So nobody knew what was going on until he actually said, we're getting married. And I don't know if it was a fear of people, if he was afraid that people would find out about him and just, try to prevent something from happening or what, but the fact that they tried to keep this secret for so long, just, it was interesting, but also it kind of added the intrigue to the story a bit. But I thought that was pretty funny. And then this is a picture of the Comrade after Grace has been in the picture. And the fact that she, that when he was going back and forth, she had ridden on the Comrade before, and he had written to her at one time that he was waiting for pictures to come back of the boat. And I think this was the picture that they were waiting for because he ordered 3 dozen of them. Half was to be in southern climes, and half he was going to be using elsewhere. We have one, so I'm glad we have one. But after they got married, they went up to a West Point Academy graduation. From there, they went to Niagara Falls, got their Niagara Falls picture taken, and then eventually, after sailing around a little bit, they came back to Marshfield and settled down. But in the winter times, they did spend a lot of time tooling around on the Comrade. It was still in use. I saw a 1922 paper. Mr. Upham passed away in 1924. So I saw a 1922 article talking about them coming into the area and just kind of visiting with friends. And I wondered what had happened to this boat. Whatever became of it. It had such an interesting history. And in the process of looking, did find out that in 1928, the Comrade the name had changed to the Jim Dozer. So somebody had bought it, and this is 4 years after Mr. Upham has passed away. And not exactly sure where it was in the interim, but this is as far as I've been able to find out what's happened to the Comrade. When you put Jim Dozer up, basically a military persona comes up, talking about who he was, but not. And I even tried contacting the Great Lakes, or history of the Great Lakes, and they couldn't track it down any further either. So, but anyway, that is the Voyage of the Comrade.